A television host asks a simple question. Does anyone here owe their life to the man sitting in the front row? One person stands, then another, then another. Within seconds, an entire studio audience is on its feet. The elderly man at the center of the room has no idea what is happening. He looks around in disbelief as hundreds of strangers reveal a truth he buried half a century earlier. Every person standing is alive because of him. Every family they created exists because of a decision he made in 1939. His name was Nicholas Winton. Before the Second World War, he rescued 669 children from Nazi-occupied Czechoslovakia. Then he told almost nobody, not his friends, not his colleagues, not even his wife. For 50 years, one of the greatest rescue missions in modern history remained hidden in a forgotten scrapbook. And the reason this ordinary man kept such an extraordinary secret may be the most remarkable part of the story. Nicholas Winton was not a heroic figure in the conventional sense when the story begins. He was 29 years old, British, working as a stockbroker in London, and planning to spend Christmas and New Year of 1938 skiing in Switzerland. He had a ticket. He had a reservation. He had every reasonable intention of going on a winter holiday like a normal young professional man in late 1930s Britain. What he had instead was a phone call from a friend named Martin Blake, who was in Prague and who asked Winton whether he might consider coming to Czechoslovakia instead of Switzerland because things there were becoming very serious and his help might be useful. Winton changed his ticket. He went to Prague, and what he found there restructured everything he had previously understood about what his life was for and what he was prepared to do with it. What was happening in Czechoslovakia in late 1938 was the direct consequence of what had been decided at Munich in September of that year, when the British and French governments had agreed to allow Nazi Germany to annex the Sudetenland, the border regions of Czechoslovakia, with significant German-speaking populations, in exchange for what British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain famously described as peace for our time. The agreement had not produced peace. It had produced a temporary postponement of conflict and the effective abandonment of Czechoslovakia to German pressure. And by the time Winton arrived in Prague in December 1938, it was increasingly clear to anyone paying attention that the remainder of Czechoslovakia would not remain independent for long. German troops had already occupied the Sudetenland. Jewish families and political refugees were flooding into Prague from the border regions, having already lost their homes and their livelihoods and their sense of safety in the areas that had been handed over. The situation had the specific quality of a catastrophe that has already begun and that most of the people in the path of it have not yet fully understood. Winton understood it. He understood it with the clarity that sometimes comes to people who are seeing a situation for the first time without the accumulated assumptions that make it harder for those who have been watching it develop gradually to see it clearly. He went to the offices of the British Committee for Refugees from Czechoslovakia, a small organization doing what it could with limited resources to help people flee a deteriorating situation, and he offered his help. What he discovered was that the committee was focused primarily on adults. The specific situation of children, the particular bureaucratic and logistical problems involved in getting children out of the country and into safety when their parents either could not leave or could not find a way to leave, was not being systematically addressed by anyone. Winton decided he would address it. He established himself in a hotel in Prague, and he began working. He set up a makeshift office in his hotel room, and he started doing what a former stockbroker and a natural organizer does when confronted with a large and complex logistical problem. He made lists. He collected information. He identified the families with children who most urgently needed to get out. He began the process of understanding what a successful evacuation of children would require and what was standing in the way of it. What was standing in the way of it was substantial. The British government required that every child coming into the country have a British family willing to take them in, a guarantee of £50 per child to cover eventual repatriation costs, and documentation that satisfied British immigration requirements. Each of these requirements represented a separate organizational challenge. Each of them required finding people willing to help, bureaucracies willing to cooperate, and systems capable of processing the volume of need that Winton was looking at in Prague. He went back to London after his initial trip with a list of children and a plan. The operation he ran from his home in London for the next 9 months is a case study in what one determined person can accomplish when they are willing to do whatever the task requires without waiting for permission or institutional support or official recognition. He wrote letters. He made phone calls. He placed advertisements in newspapers asking British families to take in refugee children. He badgered government officials, charitable organizations, anyone with any capacity to help or any authority over the processes that were blocking the movement of children out of Czechoslovakia. He forged documents when the genuine documents could not be obtained quickly enough, and the situation was urgent enough that the forgery seemed justified by the alternative. He raised money. He found families. He processed applications at his dining room table in Hampstead in the evenings after coming home from his day job at the stock exchange, because the work was happening in parallel with his regular life rather than instead of it. His mother helped. A small number of dedicated volunteers helped. But the organizing intelligence behind the operation, the person who held all the moving parts together and pushed the bureaucratic machinery forward when it stalled, was Winton. The transports that resulted from this work were part of a broader humanitarian effort known as the Kindertransport, the organized movement of Jewish and other at-risk children out of Nazi-controlled territories into safety in Britain and other countries. Between 1938 and 1940, the Kindertransport brought approximately 10,000 children to safety, one of the largest and most significant rescue operations in the history of the period. Winton's contribution was the specific Czechoslovakian component, the 669 children who traveled on 8 separate transports from Prague to London between March and August of 1939. The organization required to make each transport happen was considerable, and the obstacles were constant. Families had to be found for the children. Documentation had to be processed. Train routes had to be arranged through Germany and the Netherlands. At every stage there were delays and complications and bureaucratic obstructions that required intervention and persistence to overcome. The children who traveled on the transports were in most cases very young. The youngest were infants. Many were under 10 years old. They traveled without their parents because the parents, in most cases, could not get the documentation required to travel themselves, or could not afford the costs, or had made the calculation that they could follow later once the situation became clearer, or had made the calculation, which many of them made in the spring and summer of 1939, that the situation was serious but not yet catastrophic, and that staying together as a family was more important than separating to achieve safety. They were wrong about the situation not yet being catastrophic. Germany invaded and occupied the remainder of Czechoslovakia in March 1939, transforming the country Winton had visited in December into a German protectorate. The Jewish community of Czechoslovakia was now under direct Nazi control. The transports that had been arranged became not a precaution, but a rescue. Every child who got on a train was being pulled out of the path of something that would eventually consume the people left behind. The last transport was scheduled to leave Prague on September 1, 1939. 250 children were supposed to be on it, the largest single transport that Winton had arranged, and it would have brought the total number of children rescued to well over 900. It did not leave. On September 1, 1939, Germany invaded Poland, and Britain declared war on Germany 2 days later. The borders closed. The train stopped. The 250 children who were supposed to be on that last transport were still in Czechoslovakia when the war began. Most of them did not survive. The specificity of that number sits in the story in a way that is very difficult to process. 250 children. A train that was ready. A departure date that fell on the single worst possible day in the European calendar of 1939. The gap between the children who got out and the children who did not is measured not in policy or planning or the adequacy of the effort, but in the accident of timing, in the specific fact that the last transport was scheduled for the day the war began. Winton came home and got on with his life. He married. He had children. He worked. He participated in local community affairs and charitable work in the way that decent and civic-minded people do when they are living ordinary lives in ordinary times. He did not talk about Prague. He did not mention the transports. He did not seek recognition or publicity or the kind of acknowledgement that the scale of what he had done might seem to invite. He kept a scrapbook. The scrapbook contained lists of the children's names, photographs, letters, documents from the operation. He kept it in the attic. His wife found it there in 1988, 50 years after the events it documented. And when she began to understand what she was looking at, she encouraged him to share it with researchers and journalists who were working on the history of the Kindertransport. The BBC program, That Is Your Life, followed from there. The studio audience that stood up to face him was made of the people whose names were in that scrapbook. The people he had not mentioned. The people who had not known, for 50 years, that he existed and that their existence was connected to him in the most direct way imaginable. The recognition that came after 1988 was substantial and continued for the remaining 27 years of his life. He was awarded the MBE, then the knighthood that made him Sir Nicholas Winton. The Czech government gave him the highest state honor available to a non-Czech citizen. He received honorary citizenship from the Czech Republic and from several other countries. A train journey was organized in 2009 to mark the 70th anniversary of the Kindertransport, following the same route that the children had traveled from Prague to London, and Winton traveled on it at the age of 99, surrounded by survivors and their descendants. Streets and schools were named after him. A statue was erected at Prague's main railway station, and another at Maidenhead station near his home. The people he saved, who came to be known as Winton's children, organized themselves into a community that maintained contact with each other and with him in the years following the 1988 broadcast. And the relationship between Winton and the people whose lives he had saved became one of the more unusual and moving ongoing human connections of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Nicholas Winton died in July 2015 at the age of 106. By the time of his death, the 669 children he had saved in 1939 had produced an estimated 6,000 descendants. 6,000 people who exist because one 29-year-old stockbroker changed a skiing holiday into a trip to Prague and then went home and sat at his dining room table every evening for 9 months doing the paperwork that saved their grandparents. He never claimed that what he had done was particularly remarkable. He had a characteristic response to the recognition that came in his later years, which was to point out that many other people had done similar things under similar circumstances, and that the question worth asking was not why he had done it, but why more people had not. The question was genuine. It was not false modesty. He found the selective distribution of recognition for acts that many people had performed in different ways and in different places genuinely puzzling, and he spent a good deal of the attention he received redirecting it toward the broader history of which his contribution was a part. The scrapbook in the attic is the image that stays with you. The lists of names. The photographs of children who were somewhere between 1 and 18 years old when they were photographed, and who became people, adults, parents, grandparents, the standing audience in a television studio in 1988, and the 6,000 descendants alive today. The scrapbook sat in the attic for 50 years not because Winton had forgotten what was in it, but because he did not consider that its contents required any particular acknowledgement from the world. He had done what needed to be done. The children were alive. The documentation of how they had gotten out existed in case it was ever needed. He put it in the attic and he got on with his life. That combination of action and silence, the willingness to do something enormous and then simply not discuss it, is one of the more remarkable things about a story that contains several remarkable things. He did not save 669 children because he wanted to be remembered for it. He saved them because they needed saving, and he was in a position to help. The 50 years of silence afterward was not strategic. It was just who he was. And who he was is one of the most important stories of the 20th century. Buried in an attic for half of it, and standing in a television studio for the other half. Watching a room full of people rise to their feet to face the man who had, without fanfare, without recognition, and without any apparent expectation of either, decided that their lives were worth his time.